I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. Welcome to another episode of SAE Tomorrow Today, a show about emerging technology and trends in mobility with leaders and innovators to make it all happen. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to be joined by Darcyne Foldenauer, Executive Director, Automated Vehicle Safety Consortium, and Erin McCurry, Principal Engineer, AVSC. On today's episode, we'll explore two important AVSC efforts that are shaping the conversation around automated driving system safety. We hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us. It's great to be here.
Yeah, really excited to speak with you today.
It's wonderful to have you here. Darcyne, if you don't mind, I'd love for the audience to level set. They say Automated Vehicle Safety Consortium, AVSC. Could you, for the audience, give us a high-level overview of what the AVSC is and the important role that it plays in the automated vehicle industry, please?
Absolutely. So the AVSC, as we're fondly known, is our Automated Vehicle Safety Consortium. It is a group of companies, organizations that come together. Right now we have 8 member organizations that comprise our consortium. And they basically come together in a non-competitive manner to talk about safety and to develop best practices or information reports that will help to educate and inform the public, as well as standardize some of these best practices within the AV industry. We have a mission. It is focused on level 4 and level 5, SAE level 4 and 5, autonomous vehicles. And we quickly try to establish topics and develop these best practices so that we can get them out within 6 to 8 months, which is pretty quick considering standards development timing. And then from there, we publish them. We keep them out on our website. They're available to everyone for free to download, which is a little bit different than standards. Most times you might have to purchase a standard. Ours are available for free. And the reason is because we are trying to drive that safety of culture. And we're trying to really establish that and engender public trust in AVs as a safe and beneficial form of transportation.
Erin, do you feel the way that the AVSC is structured, as Darcyne said, you're making this publicly available at no charge, do you feel that helps to build transparency with this technology? Because not a day goes by where if you go on 3 or 4 different news sites, they have a different headline for the same exact thing. And does this help to build that transparency, which leads to trust?
Absolutely, yeah. So the AVSC represents, as Darcyne mentioned, 8 really important players in the AV industry. And while we're writing these best practices, each of those member companies bring their ideas to kind of pressure test against each other when we're formulating these documents. So what is published really represents the best ideas from each company, and we hope is really broadly applicable to other companies within this space.
Pressure test is fascinating. So if you have 8 member companies, I'm assuming 8 different strategies, 8 different corporate cultures. How did you get everybody to agree? Okay, this is the safety standard. Best practice, not a standard, best practice that we're going to adhere to. How do you bring all those individuals together and their companies say, okay, this is our North Star. We're going to do this. How do you do that?
Yeah, great question. I mean, our members don't settle for, I think, what's known as like the least common denominator. They really want to put forth what the actual best option is. And so I think that there's a lot of learnings that go on between members when we're discussing best practices. And yeah, members really have to be able to back up their ideas and kind of defend them through evidence to the rest of the members for them to be published.
That's a really interesting point, Darcyne. How much data goes into the best practices? Obviously, an individual can have they think they have the best idea or the best strategy to implement something, but at the end of the day, a lot of safety comes down to data, and there's a lot of really good data these companies are collecting. How much data does a consortium take into consideration when developing a best practice?
As much as the members will provide. That's the safe answer. Seriously, they do provide some information to us. Obviously, we're under NDAs as all of us come together to not compete. And I think that's what's beautiful is these companies do not compete when it comes to safety. But they do also have to be a little cautious about what type of information that they provide because they can't share anything that would be proprietary. But they do share a lot of their process steps. And that is where we are able to see from all these different members and take from what is provided, what are the best steps? What does everybody agree on is the best step? And then we bring that into the process that we end up publishing.
Erin, on that theme, do you put any of the data into simulation and trying to find during, say, an incident or certain potential situations of as you're developing the best practice, you're using these tools to model what could or could not be?
And Darcyne, please correct me if I'm wrong on this. I don't believe that AVSC does any of that modeling or data analysis ourselves, but we certainly do look to studies and other research papers that have been published on these topics. And a lot of them do, they're based on experiments that have been run in simulation or statistical analysis. And so we'll take all of those ideas into account when we're creating our publications.
Which is fantastic. I do want to highlight for the audience, Cornell University hosts the AVSC papers, really great scientific papers. If you want to geek out on, there's a lot of AV stuff in there. Again, it's free, really fun to read. I want to highlight two best practices today, Darcy. We're going to start with the best practice for assessment of automated driving system dedicated vehicles, known as ADS-DVS. Could you talk about that best practice, how it came about, and what is it ultimately hoping to solve and achieve?
Sure. Yeah. So, safety cases are widely used today. However, there was no common or shared way to isolate and assess individual claims that really rely on material evidence across different safety case methodologies. So for stopped conditions, I'll stick with assessment of safety case. So, because just to let you know, I'll let Erin talk mostly to the stopped conditions, but that was really why assessment of safety case. We looked at that and decided there was just a gap. A lot of safety cases, a lot of talk in the safety case area. However, there was no standard practice or process that each company could follow.
Wow. So if I'm put on my listener hat here, is that, so those 8 members agree to, if you want to use the term, a benchmark or a best practice as it relates to safety?
Yeah, that's in essence what they've done. While they all have worked on their own safety cases, it was coming together to say, what is the process for how you can assess that your safety case is substantiated with enough evidence, and what does that look like, so that everybody's following that same process.
So that's a really positive. Erin, do some of the safety cases, does it get input from regulators or government officials that oversee this, or is that data or those reports shared with government officials? Because it seems that what you're doing with the AVSC is creating a lot of good.
Yeah, right now there is nothing that says, that there's no regulation. They're working on it. We've seen a lot of that. Our hope is that our best practices will start to influence them as they start to draft some of their regulations. But right now, safety cases are shared. A lot of our companies do share them with regulators and different folks, assessors. Some have brought in third-party assessors to assess and make sure that they're following their processes. But there's nothing that's stated, here's how you do it. So while people have been doing it, they're all doing it maybe slightly differently.
That's interesting, Erin. Before this best practice came about from a safety case perspective, what happened? Did company A do it one way, company B do it another way, company C do it another way? Was it just individuals trying their best, doing it different ways, and this kind of, if you want to say, brought it all together under one tent?
Pretty much, yeah. Safety cases are commonly talked about in the AV industry, but there's no standard process of designing them, and there wasn't a good way for companies to evaluate, like Darcyne said, whether those claims are supported by evidence, which is what we established here.
And so, Erin, so saying that, so let's say one of the 8-member companies agrees to this best practice, and you're a principal engineer on the AVSC. How do they implement it? And then, most importantly, how do they get the culture to buy in? Because some of these companies have thousands of individuals, and they all have ideas. Sorry to say it, but they all have their own ideas. How do you get these cultures to embrace this when you're implementing it into the culture?
Yeah, great question. And I think that kind of relates to another best practice that AVSC has put out on safety management systems. I think that speaks more to safety culture within an organization. And so luckily our members had already worked on that and, had been implementing the best practices discussed there into their organization. As far as the safety claims best practice goes, it's really a methodology for the engineering teams to use. So, by coming together with all of these other member companies, an organization can hear more about how safety claims are evaluated, at other companies, and then kind of bring those ideas back and teach their engineering teams how to go through this same process.
And when you're assessing a safety case, or I'll use the term an incident in the real world, how much evidence data is needed, and what happens if some reason a hard drive went bad, or there's a piece of missing data? What happens then?
We have to be careful. We can't speak on behalf of our member organizations and what they might do individually. What we can do is talk about how the best practice would address it. So without having a common framework where companies can, similarly address it, they face a few concerns. Some would be inconsistent internal assessments, driven by differing interpretations of what constitutes sufficient evidence. I'm sure you've heard that. They could have high expertise barriers, as safety cases often require deep technical and domain knowledge to evaluate, as you can imagine, being highly technical. And then also the third one might be limited comparability, which makes it difficult to benchmark rigor across programs or organizations. So really, the AVSC best practice addresses these challenges, and it does so by offering structured, transparent, repeatable assessment processes that are focused on claims substantiated by evidence. And it establishes shared terminology. We talk about roles, criteria that allow organizations to systematically evaluate credibility, coherence, and sufficiency of evidence, even when safety cases differ in format or content. So really, our best practice is focused on the whole process of how you structure and put together a safety case. As they go through and evaluate the item that you were mentioning, like if they were to see a failure, that is actually once you've got the case structured and you're going through the evaluation. So probably a little bit beyond the scope of our best practice.
But it's helpful. The benchmark, you're right about that. I was speaking to a very, very large institutional fund, and they said there is no benchmark to measure. And this fund said we would commit X billion dollars if we had a benchmark to actually know what the truth is, because you meet with one person, they say something, you meet another one, they say something. So you're spot on with the benchmark. Is there ever a situation, Erin, where a safety case has to be reassessed, where it says, okay, something didn't work, something is better, perhaps we changed something? Do we ever get to a situation where it has to be reassessed, and does that fall in as part of the best practice?
Yes, I think safety cases should be reassessed, when there are new features or additions to a product's ability to perform. I think, there should be a feedback. We established that there should be a feedback loop built into safety cases to be constantly reevaluating that.
Oh, that's fascinating. So let's just say we're going to call it Acme Automotive. Let's say Acme Automotive has 3 LiDARs today, 4 cameras, and they go to 2 LiDARs, 2 radars, 4 cameras. Would that cause a safety reassessment?
Yeah, if they're claiming that by adding these additional sensors or changing their sensor suite, they can operate under different conditions or perform maneuvers that they weren't able to perform before, those need to be backed up by evidence. And so that would cause the safety case to need to be reassessed.
Well, it's a positive, though, because it's not, the thing I like about that is that it's not like, okay, we did it, check the box, next. It seems to me that from having read the best practice that, and if I'm wrong on this, please tell me, it seems like this is a living, breathing document that is meant as the technology changes, the industry changes and evolves, the best practice evolves with it.
Definitely.
One of the other ones I want to highlight, Erin, is the information report on ADS-DV stop conditions. Could you talk about that one, please?
Of course, yeah. So if you're not familiar, this best practice details nominal and off-nominal stops. So nominal is just normal behavior. And in the context of stopped conditions, a nominal stop would be any stop that an ADS-DV makes to like drop off a passenger, load or unload cargo, or contrary to what a lot of people might think, a stop that a vehicle makes in response to another road user. So even if it's like a hard stop because a pedestrian emerges from behind a vehicle, that stop is actually considered nominal because it's doing what it's supposed to do. We also detail off-nominal stops, which is basically just the opposite of a nominal stop. The vehicle is stopping because something is wrong. These type of stops happen because there's either a system fault or the vehicle encounters a scenario that it cannot yet handle. And then we further categorize off-nominal stops into recoverable or non-recoverable stops.
And then at some point, does that trigger remote operations? Does that what triggers that, or for an individual to look at the cameras to see what's going on?
Yeah. So remote assistance can occur to provide, or remote assistance can provide, like you said, additional information to the ADS-DV to make a better informed decision. So in our information report, we talk about remote assistance in the context of recoverable stops. So just like a human, when you come across an emergency scene or a crash scene, you might stop and, take in the information around you. You might look for an open lane of travel. You might look for someone giving you directions on, where to go. And the ADS-DV may do that as well. It might stop and, ask a remote assistant, is this police officer directing me, or is this lane open for me to travel in? And then once it receives that information, it can go on its way.
But that's a huge positive at the end of the day. It's almost, if you want to use the term supervise, but to me, it is a huge positive. And I'm just, because there's a scenario I want to talk to you about. When you mentioned stopped, is that going from, say, 60 miles an hour to 40 miles an hour, or is that going all the way down to zero? How would you define and classify that?
Yeah, no, this is a stop is when the vehicle is not moving, velocity of zero. And that's a good point, because we do talk about minimal risk conditions in the information report, which is the act of getting into a safe area to safely stop. So that's like pulling over to the side of the road. And that's in contrast to a minimal risk condition, which is when the vehicle is actually in that stopped position.
I'll give you an example. I know it's not directly stopped, but I was in a vehicle with no driver on the highway last week, and we were in the left lane, and this gentleman in the car must have been going 90 miles an hour and cut us off. If I was driving, I would have slammed the brakes on. But this vehicle, the vehicle I was riding in, it started to slow down. All suddenly, this not so nice driver went in front of it. And if you run your phone and pay attention, this is normal. But it was really, truly amazing how the vehicle was looking around all these conditions. Somebody cuts us off. It's human instinct. Okay, slam the brakes on. That's what we're going to do. But no, I mean, it just goes into how safe these vehicles really are. And Darcyne, so we're seeing movement now in the autonomous vehicle industry of the emergence of fleet ownership. It's starting to be talked a lot on earnings calls. Companies are actively talking about it. You develop these world-class best practices. And in the future, a lot of the autonomous vehicles will not be owned by the companies developing. They're going to be owned by fleets. How can these world-class best practices be, I don't want to say transferred to a fleet operator or fleet manager? How can they leverage them and say, hi, there's a guide here for you to do this, for you to implement this the right way?
Well, our hope is that these best practices lead into standards, official standards. We actually, Erin and I both participate in different SDOs, which is Standard Development Organizations, and we try to get it into global organizations so that these will become a standard, meaning best practices are voluntary, whereas a standard is something that you need to follow. And if these organizations start to follow them eventually as a standard, that also means that it becomes not just voluntary, but everybody starts to follow them. So I think that leads to where you were headed with, okay, right now these are fleet managed vehicles. Eventually, Yeah, there is. I think a lot of people see that these have the potential for personal car ownership, and it will go beyond, just a fleet. But those organizations who are developing and manufacturing them will still need to follow them.
Erin, we're going back to the stop situation because you mentioned something. Let's just say a law enforcement individual. The vehicle's at a stop. The officer has his hand up or crosswalk. How does the best practice work with situations like that are very common in cities around the world? Okay, stop, children. Okay, no. Okay, yes. There's a. I saw it this morning. So there's a down wire, and you have the police officer waving you to go on the other side. And the vehicle comes to a complete stop. How does the best practice fit into those situations, which are very common?
Yeah, great question. So this, the stopped conditions information report doesn't, prescribe exact behaviors for situations like that. The goal of this publication is really to standardize language that we use when we talk about those situations. So, in the example that I had earlier about, defining the minimal risk maneuver of pulling over and then you're stopping on the side of the road, and we call that a minimal risk condition. If it sounds familiar, it's because it's a standard part of driving. We've all seen vehicles on the side of the road. If you've ever gotten a flat tire, found a safe place to pull over and stopped, you've executed a minimal risk maneuver to achieve a minimal risk condition. And by the way, you've also performed an off-nominal stop, and that's going to be either recoverable or non-recoverable based on if you're able to get the tire changed or if you require a tow. So we're really just trying to give common language to these situations that human drivers and ADS-DVs find themselves in to better, be able to make progress in standards like what Darcyne is talking about, and just so we can all start from a common understanding of the language that we're using.
Okay, let's stay on the common language here. In your words, how do you define the difference between minimal risk maneuver and minimal risk condition? Simple terms, not engineering fun terms, but simple terms where the audience says, hey, okay, I get this.
Yeah. So a minimal risk maneuver is the action that you or the vehicle are taking to get to a safe place to stop. So that's, if you're on a road, making sure that you can safely pull over and you're not cutting anyone off or, interrupting the flow of traffic too much to get to a safe place to stop. And then the minimal risk condition is, like I said, the actual state of being stopped safely outside of the line of travel of any other road users.
Okay, I'm going down the rabbit hole. Next follow-up. When is it safer for the AV to stay in the lane rather than going to the side of the road?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. And like you said earlier of the example of, a vehicle cutting you off on the highway, maybe a human driver would stop because you weren't tracking it from behind you. We don't have eyes on the back of our heads. For an ADS-DV, we typically say it's never safer for a vehicle to stay stopped in a lane. We'd always prefer a safe place to pull over. And luckily, the 360-degree sensors on most ADS-DVs make that possible. The one case is in the event of a crash, sometimes it's typically safer for the vehicle to stay put and stay stopped where it is.
I know this is not what we're talking about today, but Darcyne, I'm very curious. Has the AVSC an incident of a crash? Have you put out a best practice of what happens in those scenarios? Have you tackled that yet?
We have. I want to say it was last March. We published a best practice for post-crash behaviors and interactions, and it deals with immediate post-crash. So we have a flow chart that shows, what happens, pre-crash, then there's the immediate post-crash, and then there's maybe scene management and then scene clearance. So we did define that. And again, like to talk about the terms. We always try to clarify with definitions and terms. But the focus was on immediate post-crash at that time because there had been a lot of discussion within media, within news, always focused on, different events that had taken place. So we felt it was important to address what happens immediately after a crash so that people understand and maybe feel a little more comfortable that there is some processes that are followed during those scenarios. And we actually end that best practice by talking about questions that the ADS-DV would go through, and it asks itself, looking at the surroundings, and it does address exactly that. Is it safer to stay in lane, or should we pull over? So it goes through a series of questions to determine what is the best course of action to take. And then if I could also add, we can't say a whole lot about in-process work, but we can talk about topics. And so one of the topics that our work groups is working on right now, developing into a best practice, is actually focused on, similarly to that immediate post-crash, we're now looking ahead. What happens before a crash? So that is something that we're looking at. Pre-crash scenario competencies is something that title may change, but we're definitely in the process of working with a work group on that. So look for that to come in the future.
I know I'm going to oversimplify this, but I have to ask, is the goal of the AVSC to build the playbook for the proper way to deploy autonomous vehicles in a safe manner? Is that the overarching goal? Because it seems to me that, I don't know, I'm going to use a cake analogy. You're making a cake and you have all the ingredients to make a really great cake, is how I'm seeing this.
I would say similar to that. Yes, I think our goal has been to focus on building a case for safety around autonomous vehicles. And if you were to look at our publication since 2019 and how we've released different ones, the very first one was in fallback test drivers. Well, you think about back in 2019, we were still using test drivers and there wasn't a lot published about how that process should be managed. So that was where it started. From there, we focused on many different areas, building and understanding your ODD, your operational design domain, focusing on safety management systems, as Erin mentioned, is another one. Change risk management, so that there's a process for managing change. So building out a lot of processes so that people can see there is a case for safety around these AVs.
Erin, we can't talk about safety without talking about independence. How important is independence between the safety case owner, the claim owner, and the evidence owner? Because it seems that there has to be some sort of, in my opinion, there has to be independence there.
Definitely. Yeah. And it's very important. How each organization maintains that independence varies. Some folks have kind of parallel setups between their engineering and safety teams, where you have different folks who are responsible for looking at the same feature or item that's being built and evaluating it from an engineering and safety perspective. Whereas other folks have, a safety team within an engineering team that is focused on looking at the safety of each feature. But you have to be independent. You can't have the same person building and designing the feature who's also doing the investigation to ensure that it is meeting all of the evidence criteria as well.
One of your members, a friend of mine, is their head of safety, and I'll, for privacy, remove this individual's name, but a very smart individual. And when they're making critical safety decisions, this individual told me, he goes, it's a committee of individuals that all have to agree, where it's not just one individual say, okay, let's go. There's a group of individuals, at least as this one company, that all have to agree to that. Is that common practice, where if you look at your 8-member companies, we don't have to name names, but where it's not just one individual saying, okay, time to go, driver goes bye-bye, or okay, we're going to do this. Is it common to have multiple people that have to all agree to make those big decisions that have a big impact on safety?
Yeah, I think the concept of, some folks call it a safety board, is common practice. And it's also kind of how the AVSC operates, with, representatives from different companies coming together and, having to defend a position in a best practice in order to move forward. So I think that's a good parallel to draw between what we're doing here and also what our member organizations are doing within their own teams.
I mean, Erin, you're doing really great work at the AVSC. Your member companies are doing great work. And remove yourself from that role and from the relationship with those 8 companies. What do you think is some of the most misunderstood stuff as it relates to safety? Because I read a lot, and boy, oh boy, it goes all over the map. What do you think some of the most misunderstood things are out there, and how are you trying to solve it with AVSC?
Yeah. So I do think that one of the most misunderstood things that we're reading a lot about right now are stops that ADS-DVs make. So just to relate it to, one of the topics that we're talking about today, not every stop that an ADS-DV makes is non-recoverable. So when we read in the news about an ADS-DV stopping, at a crash scene or an emergency scene, like I mentioned earlier, it might just need a little bit of time to take in the scene or request remote assistance. So that's why we're trying to establish these terms to hope that the rest of industry and regulators and maybe even media can start using these terms to give a better, more full picture into what's going on with the vehicle.
Boom. You're right. Because the vehicle is not, I'll use a Star Wars term, not going rogue. It's sitting there and it's making the best decision. Darcyne, what have you seen out there? I mean, you're running this as the executive director. I'm sure you've seen wowzer lands of all sorts of stuff.
I think the interesting thing is I actually got to take a ride in a Zoox vehicle. This was last December, and that was out in Las Vegas. And it was a great, I was in the ride and I was facing backwards. So as you can imagine, we had one of the Zoox team members sitting across from me. They're watching it as it's in normal direction. And all of a sudden, there was a hard brake of the bot, as they call it. And of course, you're wondering, what happened? What's up? And then we all looked and we realized that it did exactly what it was supposed to do. It was a perfect example of a nominal stop, by the way, because we would consider it nominal driving. But as we were going, the reason the bot stopped is there was a stake truck that was starting to nose its way into the road. If you've ever been driving as a human driver and you see a big truck and it's starting to nose into the lane and you're not sure that they're going to stop, the bot had the same reaction as a human driver. It stopped basically. It hard braked. It waited. The stake truck paused and realized it had gone too far, kind of sat there, and the bot continued on its way. So to me, that is a good personal example of me seeing it in action and understanding that that is a nominal stop. It did what it was supposed to do. So I think if more people had an experience riding in these vehicles and understood the amount of validation testing, such as when we're using assessment of safety cases, the structure that these organizations go through when they're actually building their safety case and testing and validating everything. The level of detail that they go to is amazing. And of course, my background originally before AVs was in quality, so I completely understand validation and verification testing. And these vehicles would not be out on the road unless there was a reason, something substantial that said they were okay to be there.
What you just described is safety. And because there is data from National Safety Council, I think there actually is even NHTSA data on this, old, but the epidemic, which I call it, of distracted driving on the phones. There could have been an individual, not you, but another individual could have been staring at their phone and unfortunately got into a crash with that truck. But the AV doesn't have a phone. It's not ET. It's not phoning home. It's always paying attention and creating a safer environment. And yes, it stopped because it was the safe thing to do. And that's where these best practices come in, because as I said earlier, AVSC is building the playbook for the deployment of autonomous vehicles. This has been a fascinating conversation. And as we look to wrap up, what would you like our listeners to take away with them? Darcyne, we'll start with you, please.
I think the biggest thing is I would love for people to recognize that these AVs are safe, that we are building that culture of safety. I would encourage everyone to check out our work, which is out on our website. We have 18 best practices that we have published since 2019. They are all available there for free, and we just encourage people to please take a look at that and review our work.
Take a look at it. You can learn something. I find them fascinating. Erin, what would you like our listeners to take away with them today?
I mean, ditto. Also, just adding to what we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast, which is our members are working really hard to put all of these best practices together. It's, we have the safety experts from all of these industry leaders, which for me personally is a great group to work with because, we're getting the best ideas. people are really working to come together and agree and share information to put these publications together. And, it's a lot of work, and it's based on a lot of research that these companies have done. So we're hopeful that others can adopt them, and we can see some of these best practices become standards.
It's a lot of work, but it's important work. And important work is great work. Today is tomorrow. Tomorrow's today. The feature is AVSC. Darcyne, Erin, thank you so much for coming on SAE Tomorrow Today.
Thank you. Thank you, Grayson, for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to SAE Tomorrow Today. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, please kindly rate, review, and let us know what topics you'd like for us to explore next. Be sure to join us next week when we speak with California's Secretary of Transportation about managing large-scale infrastructure, electric vehicle adoption, infrastructure priorities, and what's next for rail.
SAE International makes no representations as to the accuracy of the information presented in this podcast. The information and opinions are for general information only. SAE International does not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast.